If you walk down the fertilizer aisle of any modern garden center in August, you will see people standing there with a look of quiet defeat in their eyes. They are staring at rows of brightly colored plastic jugs, each one promising a miracle. This one is $40 for a bag of premium bloom booster. That one is $30 for a specialty liquid calcium blend. People load their carts with these expensive chemical solutions because they are desperate. They look at their own gardens and see exactly what they dread: lush, giant green bushes that refuse to set fruit, or blossoms that dry up and drop off the vine before they ever form a tomato. It is a modern, complicated way to garden, and it costs a fortune every single summer. But if you had driven past a quarter-acre lot in Bakersfield, California on any hot August afternoon before 2019, you would have seen something that completely shatters that whole commercial illusion. You would have seen an old man named Earl Whitaker standing by his south fence, looking at Cherokee purples and mortgage lifters hanging like heavy Christmas ornaments, 6 and 7 feet off the ground. Tomatoes the size of your fist, clustered thick on the vine. Earl did not have a degree in soil science. He did not own a single bottle of branded liquid nutrients. He proved this out for 41 straight growing seasons using a single, plain cardboard box that sits in the laundry aisle of every grocery store in America, right next to the detergents. It costs about $4, and a single box will last a home gardener 10 years. Stop and think about that contrast. On one side, a multi-billion-dollar industry selling you a complex 3-step chemical program every spring. On the other side, an old man with 2 flat spoonfuls of a white laundry powder dissolved in a gallon of well water, producing a harvest that made people pull their cars over just to stare. Now understand this clearly. This is not a magic trick, and it is not a universal cure-all. If your plants are freezing in the shade, or if you refuse to water them, no white powder is going to save your season. It will not fix poor drainage, and it will not stop a late blight from taking your vines. But if you have healthy green plants that simply will not hold on to their blossoms, or if your fruit comes in small, hollow, and tasting like wet grocery store cardboard, this addresses the exact biological bottleneck holding your soil back. I am a storyteller and a researcher, not a corporate scientist. I spent 2 winters down in the basement of the Agricultural Library at the University of California, Davis, digging through old extension bulletins from the 1920s through the 1980s. I wanted to see where this knowledge came from, and as I turned those yellowed pages, decade by decade, I watched a specific word simply disappear from the official recommendations. The word was borax. It was not erased because it stopped working. It was allowed to sink quietly under a mountain of nicer-looking, more profitable packaging. The truth is, Earl learned this method from his father, who took it home from a county extension agent named Harland Pruitt in Oklahoma back in 1934. That was the very heart of the Dust Bowl. The wind had stripped the topsoil right off the plains, and with it went the vital trace elements vegetables need to set fruit. Families were starving on land that had fed them for a generation. Pruitt understood something that the big fertilizer companies would later spend a great deal of money helping everybody forget. A tomato plant is not fundamentally hungry for nitrogen. Pour heavy nitrogen on a tomato, and you get a beautiful dark green, leafy bush, and almost no fruit. A tomato plant is hungry for boron. Boron is what we call a micronutrient. A plant needs only a tiny pinch of it compared to the big 3 elements like nitrogen or potassium. But tiny does not mean optional. A human can fail for want of a trace of a vitamin they need only a microgram of, and a tomato vine will fail completely without a trace of boron. Without it, the plant simply cannot finish the job of moving sugars from its leaves into its fruit. The cell walls do not form right. The pollen tubes cannot extend to fertilize the blossoms, so the flowers turn yellow and drop to the dirt before they ever set a single tomato. When you do get fruit from a boron-starved plant, it is corky, brown, and puckered at the bottom. a textbook case of deficiency that thousands of gardeners blame on the weather or their own bad luck every single year. Back in 1939, the Department of Agriculture published a multi-year study on this exact element. On boron-poor soil, the plants that received a small, measured dose of supplemental boron produced more than 4 times the marketable fruit of the identical plants right next to them that got none. 4 times the harvest from a treatment that cost less than a fraction of a single penny per plant. I have seen this same sudden leap in old notebooks kept by traditional gardeners in my own community. A woman named Doris, who has grown heirlooms on the same half-acre for 40 years, found this method in an old pamphlet. Her records show that her regular harvest of 300 pounds of fruit a year suddenly jumped to over 600 pounds the very summer she introduced this white powder. The same beds, the same varieties, the same climate, but the numbers doubled and never came back down. Why don't we hear about this anymore? Why do we continue to pay $40 for a bag of specialty fertilizer every spring when the real answer has been sitting on the laundry shelf since before our grandmothers were born? It comes down to simple economics. By the late 1970s, a tiny handful of massive chemical companies took control of the retail fertilizer market. There is immense profit in selling a beautifully marketed, branded solution with a smiling picture of a tomato on the bag. There is absolutely no profit in telling a homeowner to walk past the entire garden center and buy a $4 box of plain sodium tetraborate that nobody can patent. So the information was allowed to fade out of the pamphlets. A whole generation grew up believing that traditional methods were just old wives' tales, replacing cheap, practical knowledge with expensive chemical dependencies. But the biology of the tomato has not changed since it was carried out of its original volcanic, boron-rich soil in the Andes Mountains thousands of years ago. The plant still expects that nutrient to be there, and when it isn't, the engine stalls. Earl Whitaker's grandson still has the cardboard box of borax his grandfather bought back in 1978 for 98 cents. The label is faded soft, but if you tip it, there is still white powder in the bottom. 41 summers of legendary tomatoes came out of that single box, and it is still not empty. This knowledge does not wear out. It does not expire, and it does not belong to a corporation. But before you walk out to your garden shed, you have to understand that boron is a precise tool. The window between a perfect harvest and a ruined, poisoned bed is incredibly narrow, much narrower than with any ordinary fertilizer. If you eyeball this or guess the amount, you will burn your plants to a crisp. You must know the exact proportion, the water temperature, the mixing technique, and the 2 specific cellular moments in the plant's life cycle when this must be applied. Step away from the garden beds for a moment and come inside to the kitchen counter. To do this right, you need to approach it with the same quiet focus you would bring to baking a loaf of sourdough bread or measuring out a traditional herbal remedy. This is not the time for casual tossing or estimating by eye. Go down to the laundry aisle and look for that heavy cardboard box. When you pick it up, it shouldn't smell like wildflowers or spring rain. If you catch a whiff of artificial perfume, put it back. Turn the box over and look at the fine print on the back. It must say 100% sodium tetraborate decahydrate and absolutely nothing else. No optical brighteners, no added detergents, no synthetic fragrances. What we want is the pure, raw mineral deposit. A clean white powder that feels slightly granular between your fingers, almost like fine sea salt, completely devoid of any soapy slickness. Ply a clean, empty 1-gallon plastic jug on the counter. A transparent milk jug works best because you need to see what is happening inside. Next, get a standard kitchen butter knife and a metal measuring teaspoon. Do not use a plastic spoon that can flex or a large soup spoon from the drawer. Dip the teaspoon into the box and bring out a rounded scoop. It will look like a miniature snowdrift. Now, take the flat edge of the butter knife. Lay it flat against the rim of the spoon and scrape it across in one smooth, deliberate motion. The excess powder falls back into the box, leaving you with a perfectly flat, level surface. That is 1 teaspoon. Slide it into the mouth of the jug. Repeat the exact same process a second time. 2 level teaspoons. No more, no less. Stop and think about why we are being this precise. If you were pouring nitrogen, a heavy hand would just mean extra weeding later. With boron, an extra half teaspoon is the difference between a record-breaking harvest and a toxic patch of dirt where nothing will grow for 3 seasons. We are operating in micrograms at the root level, so let the knife do its job. Now, turn on your kitchen tap. We need warm water, not boiling from a kettle, and not cold from the garden hose. Adjust the handles until the stream feels like comfortable bath water against the inside of your wrist, right around 100 degrees. If it is too cold, the white crystals will simply sit at the bottom of the jug like stubborn sand, refusing to break down. If it is too hot, you risk warping the plastic or altering the stability of the solution. Fill the jug halfway. Cap it tight, grip the neck, and shake it vigorously for a slow count of 30. As you shake, you will hear the sharp, gritty sound of the crystals slapping against the plastic walls. Watch through the side of the jug as the water turns cloudy, a milky white swirl. Keep shaking until that gritty sound stops entirely. Set the jug down and fill it the rest of the way to the 1-gallon mark with that same warm water. Cap it again. Give it one final turn to distribute the heat, and then sit down. Let it rest on the counter for 10 minutes. This pause is just as important as the shaking. It allows the water molecules to fully dismantle the mineral bonds. When you return, the water should be perfectly clear again, as transparent as if it came straight from a mountain spring, with no white sediment resting in the bottom creases of the jug. This is your stock solution. It has no smell, no expiration date, and it will not degrade if you store it in a dark cupboard. Now, take your jug out to the garden. The timing of this application must match the rhythm of the day. Never do this under the glare of the noon sun when the soil is hot and baking. Wait until the early morning, right as the dew is beginning to lift between 6 and 9 o'clock, or in the soft twilight after 7 in the evening. When the sun is low, the plant's roots are relaxed, breathing, and drinking slowly, rather than desperately pumping water to cool the leaves. Before you pour a single drop, look down at the base of your tomato plants. If the soil is dry, cracked, and dusty, stop. Do not apply the solution to thirsty ground. Dry soil acts like a sponge with massive pores. It will suck the boron down too fast and too deep, concentrating it in pockets that can shock the feeder roots. Water your garden thoroughly with plain water first, the day before, or a few hours prior, so the dirt is evenly damp, cool, and receptive. To apply it, do not just tip the gallon jug over the plant. Get a small, clean measuring cup, the kind you use for liquid ingredients. Dip out exactly 1.5 cups of the clear solution for a standard-sized plant, or 2 full cups if you are treating a massive 7-foot heirloom vine like a mortgage lifter. Step up to the vine and visualize a circle about 4 inches away from the main green stem. This is the drip line, the zone where the fine hair-like feeder roots sit just beneath the surface, waiting to pull nutrients sideways into the plant. Pour the liquid slowly in a deliberate, gentle ring around that circle. Do not rush it. Do not let it puddle or splash against the main stalk. The consistency of the liquid should feel lightweight as it enters the soil, sinking in smoothly within seconds, leaving no crust or residue behind. The most common mistake beginners make happens right after this step. They look at the remaining liquid in the jug, think about how much they want big tomatoes, and decide to go around for a second pass. Or they decide to apply it every single week when they water. Understand this. You do this exactly twice in an entire year. Once when the very first yellow blossoms appear, and once more when those blossoms turn into green fruits the size of a golf ball. That is the entire protocol. If you overdo it, the plant will tell you within 48 hours, and it is a heartbreaking sight. The tips of the leaves will turn a sickly, paper-thin yellow, followed by a crisp, scorched brown along the edges, as if they had been touched by a lighter. The new growth at the top of the vine will begin to distort, curling tightly downward like a claw. Once that boron toxicity sets into the soil, you cannot simply wash it away. It takes months of heavy rain to leach it out of the root zone. Respect the boundary of the method, trust the math that Earl Whitaker used for 41 years, and let the plant do its work in its own time. To truly trust a method passed down through generations, you have to look past the folklore and understand the quiet engineering happening inside the plant itself. Once you see the actual biology at play, this stops looking like a backyard secret and begins to look like the exact piece of natural science that it is. Think of your tomato plant as a sprawling, complex highway system. The leaves are the factories, working from sunrise to sunset, converting sunlight and air into pure sugars. The developing tomatoes hanging on the vine are the destination cities that desperately need those sugars to grow plump, heavy, and sweet. In an ordinary plant, those sugars have to travel down the stems through microscopic tubes. This is where boron comes in. Boron acts exactly like the grease on the gears of that transport system. It forms a temporary chemical bond with the sugars, making them highly soluble and mobile, allowing them to glide effortlessly through the plant's pathways. When boron is missing from the soil, the grease dries up. The highway grinds to a halt. The sugars get backed up in the leaves, unable to reach the fruit. The gardener looks at a vine that is lush and green, but bears fruit that tastes like absolutely nothing, completely unaware that the sugars are trapped just inches away from the tomato itself. But its most critical job happens at the very moment of creation, inside the yellow blossom. When a grain of pollen lands on the center of a tomato flower, fertilization is not finished. That microscopic grain of pollen has to physically grow a tiny, hollow tube all the way down through the neck of the flower into the ovary to deliver its cargo. This growth happens at a stunning speed in the plant world, and it requires a massive sudden influx of calcium to build the cell walls of that expanding tube. Here is the catch. A plant cannot move calcium without boron. Boron is the key that unlocks the door, allowing the plant to absorb calcium and stitch it into the cellular glue, called pectin, that holds the cell walls together. Without that key, the pollen tube stalls halfway through its journey. The flower realizes it cannot be fertilized, turns a sickly yellow, and drops to the dirt. You can pour all the specialty calcium sprays you want onto your garden. But if the soil lacks that tiny trace of boron, the plant cannot use it. The blossom falls, and the harvest is lost before it ever begins. Now, let us be entirely honest about the limitations of this method, because a master practitioner never promises a miracle without showing you the boundaries of the craft. This protocol is not a magic wand for every garden in America, and there are specific conditions where it will fail completely or where you shouldn't use it at all. First, consider your soil type. If you are gardening in heavy, rich, dark clay, the kind that holds water for days and cracks when it dries, your soil likely retains its trace elements quite well. Clay particles have a strong negative electrical charge that holds onto micronutrients. If you use this method on heavy clay without seeing any signs of deficiency first, you run a very high risk of overloading the bed. Conversely, if your garden is built on sandy soil, or if you are growing in raised beds filled with a loose, artificial peat and perlite mix, boron behaves completely differently. It doesn't stick. Because boron is highly water-soluble, every heavy rain or deep watering washes it right past the root zone and down into the subsoil. On sandy or artificial soils, the two-application rule is an absolute necessity because the soil has zero capacity to store the element for the plant. Second, we must look at the chemistry of your water and your earth, specifically the pH scale. If you live in an area with highly alkaline soil and hard, limestone-heavy well water, common throughout parts of the American Southwest, the boron might be physically present in your dirt, but it is chemically locked up. High pH binds boron, making it invisible to the roots. In these specific conditions, pouring the solution onto the soil is less effective because the earth instantly freezes it in place. Gardeners in those regions often have to apply the solution even more carefully, ensuring the ground is thoroughly damp beforehand to allow the roots a fleeting moment to drink it in before the soil chemistry binds it. Finally, understand the limits of what this nutrient can do for other crops. While a tomato is an absolute glutton for boron because of its intense flowering and fruiting cycle, other backyard vegetables are incredibly sensitive to it. If you have leftover solution in your jug, do not casually pour it over your rows of green beans, peas, or cucumbers. Legumes have a notoriously low tolerance for boron. A dose that makes a tomato thrive will act like a chemical herbicide on a bush bean, scalding the leaves and killing the plant within days. This is a specialized tool for heavy fruiting solanaceous plants, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, and it must be kept strictly within that family. We are dealing with a balance that nature spent thousands of years perfecting in the mountain soils of South America. When we bring that plant into our backyards, we take on the responsibility of keeping that balance true. It is a precise piece of biology, tested by old men on small lots, and verified by forgotten federal studies. But knowing the science and the limits is only half the battle. To actually see those fist-sized tomatoes hanging on your fence, you have to see exactly how to execute this in the dirt, month by month, as the season unfolds. When you hold a faded piece of paper from nearly a century ago, you realize that knowledge doesn't belong to the person who writes it down. It belongs to the people who keep it alive in the dirt. The story of boron in the American garden isn't a collection of scattered rumors. It is a documented history of survival during the hardest years of the 1930s, when families across the Great Plains watched their topsoil turn to black blizzards of dust. County extension agents weren't trying to sell products. They were trying to keep people alive. Men like Harlan Pruitt walked from farm to farm with typed bulletins tucked into their overalls, showing families how a single 5-cent box of laundry powder could make a dying garden yield food again. In 1939, when the United States Department of Agriculture finalized its multi-year field studies on boron, they didn't hide the results. They published the data plainly in circulars, distributed to every small-town library and post office across the country. They proved that commercial-scale growers and backyard families alike were fighting a ghost, a quiet deficiency that could be solved by a mineral dug straight out of the California desert. Then the world changed. The post-war industrial boom arrived, and with it came the great shift toward commercial chemical farming. The simple extension leaflets were put into drawers. The bright plastic bags took over the shelves, and within a generation, the plain, unpatentable truth was buried under an avalanche of marketing. But a true solution never truly dies as long as someone remembers to pass it down. It lived on through Earl Whitaker, on his quarter-acre lot in Bakersfield, his giant brandywines, catching the afternoon sun along the south fence for 41 years. It lived on in the handwritten garden journals of Doris in North Carolina, where the ink changes and the harvest numbers suddenly double on the page. It lived on in the schoolyard beds of El Paso, where Patricia used that $4 box to feed a neighborhood. These people didn't know each other, but they shared the exact same inheritance. A piece of practical, tested self-sufficiency that required no specialty store, no subscription, and no corporate permission. This brings us back to your own garden plot. The real beauty of this method lies in its absolute accessibility. You do not need to hire a soil consultant. You do not need to tear out your beds or replace your earth with expensive, bagged mixes. The answer has been sitting quietly in the laundry aisle, completely ignored, for longer than most of us have been alive. This coming spring, when you walk past the garden center displays with their smiling promises and $40 price tags, I want you to hesitate. Keep walking. Go find that plain green and yellow cardboard box. Measure the 2 level teaspoons with the flat edge of a butter knife. Shake it into a gallon of warm water until the liquid clears, and pour it gently around the root zones when the first small yellow blossoms open to the sun. Do it not just for the heavy, fist-sized tomatoes that will hang from your vines in August, and not just for the rich, deep sweetness that will make you remember what a real tomato is supposed to taste like. Do it because every time you mix that simple solution, you are keeping a chain of traditional knowledge unbroken. You are refusing to forget what our grandparents knew to be true: that nature is often incredibly simple when we stop trying to buy our way out of her problems. Try it on a few plants this season. See the truth of it with your own eyes, and then pass it down to your children and your neighbors. Because that is the only place a secret like this is ever truly safe.